This past weekend, Hell Let Loose Vietnam had an open beta that featured over 350,000 players trying out the game. Recently, I talked about some of the issues I saw in an invitation-only playtest, and I got some time to play the open beta this past weekend, and I want to discuss some of the things that I think are still plaguing some of the gameplay. But the most significant news is that the game was supposed to release on June 18th, and it has now been delayed. The delay is about 2 months, and it's now intended to launch on August 13th. So I think now's a good time to talk about some of the issues some of us saw in the open beta, as well as what we hope to fix. But first, hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below with your thoughts or what you encountered during the beta. And don't forget that you can support the channel by hitting the join button below the video player to become a member. So before this past weekend, I talked about some of the things that I noticed in a private playtest that I had the opportunity to join. And some of the issues that I ran into during that private playtest still existed within the open beta this past weekend. But what I think is important is that we discuss those along with some of the things that I just generally noticed in the open beta. And one thing that tends to stand out to me from a gameplay perspective is just the lack of value of life. Things are happening so quickly, it's a lot of rinse and repeat. You run till you die, you may not even know where you get killed from, and then you're running back at it as quickly as possible. Of course, this is an open beta, and my expectations aren't crazy high for how team play and all that stuff may be factored in, but it did seem noticeably absent, and a lot of that is because people either weren't using their microphones or not looking to coordinate very much. But it did feel pretty easy just to throw a body at a problem and hope that something good comes out of it. And this seems somewhat heightened because you have a lot of concealment on the Hell Let Loose Vietnam map for the open beta, but the problem is you don't have a ton of cover. You're running through bushes and sometimes you're running into bullets. And something that complicates the teamwork aspect of what's going on in your squad is the fact that you get almost no audio cue as to what happened to you. Like, a lot of games give you some form of audio cue to at least have a understanding of maybe where you got hit from, what you got hit by, or something along those lines. I couldn't find that consistently or at all within Hell Let Loose Vietnam's open beta. In addition, it was very clear how fast TTK, or time to kill, is in this game. There was very minimal time to react to suppression or actually getting hit. You had to move very quick and dive into cover. But generally the pace is just so fast, and the lack of medics tended to make you just respawn and do it all over. That was beside the medic that was typically my squad. Outside of that squad medic, I didn't see many medics really doing a ton of reviving. In fact, I kind of wish they would open it up so that you could have 2 medics per squad. And while I don't expect any sort of crazy strategic or tactical gameplay, I think having multiple medics per squad would help with that sort of redundancy of doing the same act repeatedly, because you'd have maybe the opportunity to have more revives actually happen, especially given there's just not as much cover around the villages. Now, tied to more advanced gameplay, as well as one of the features of Vietnam, is tunnels and helicopters. A one-man squad could build tunnels all over the map, creating a complex network for where the NVA can spawn and attack from, maybe even getting behind the enemy more frequently based on what they're able to set up. Now, my friend Stretch actually dove into this a little bit and ran a one-man squad just building tunnel networks, and it seemed to be pretty effective. And you can tell how this is useful based on the progression just during this one round in these images. But if you operate the NVA this way and you continue to lean on that tunnel system, it's really hard for the US Armed Forces to keep up. Now, I know some folks are upset that there's not like a whole tunnel system that you can run through physically, instead of it's a fast travel system, but it kind of makes sense. I don't think we can spare any more resources to something that's underground. But we'll talk more about performance in a minute. But I do think the NVA has a significant leg up in their ability to get troops around the map compared to the helicopters of the US Armed Forces, which are very noticeable. So while you can move troops around, getting an OP up that's not going to get burned pretty quickly can be tough just because of the audio cue and the fact, again, that they can be seen from pretty far. I do think the US Armed Forces, utilizing the helicopters, have the ability to get troops out and spread out pretty quickly at the start of a round. But as the round progresses, it becomes much more difficult because then you're landing where infantry is, it becomes harder to keep OPs up, and it's less effective. The NVA can get those tunnels out pretty quickly with minimal effort, which makes it really powerful compared to the helicopter. Now, one of my biggest concerns and complaints about the private playtest I played in a few weeks back was that audio was just kind of a mess. I couldn't differentiate weaponry, all the sounds were kind of overwhelming, and it was just a lot to take in without giving me a ton of nuance to understand, hey, this is where this is happening, this is the distance that this is happening at. I wasn't able to get intel off of audio very easily. And that still seemed to be an issue, and there was some performance aspect of it too, where some sounds would just go missing, but I think that was a different issue entirely, probably a bug. Your small arms fire tend to feel very light without much of a bassy tone to it. It makes it seem like it's further away than it actually may be. But then again, I was just having a hard time telling distance regardless. While helicopters didn't seem as imposing, tanks still felt kind of quiet. It was sometimes hard to know exactly where they were when I was running around with AT. The more ambient noises in the jungle were nice, but then I would hear that snap of a twig or something like that and start looking in that direction. Sometimes I'd find something, sometimes I wouldn't. It was kind of hard to tell what was intentional, maybe versus just what's supposed to be there. I think your own weapon sounds pretty good. The commander assets sound pretty good. The just ambient noise is often pretty cool, but there's just stuff that seems to be lacking in the overall depth of how the audio is supposed to be. Like, it just feels too light. I think some sort of pass through some small arms fire and stuff like that would add a lot of value to the audio that you're hearing in the game. Now, another area that I talked about was visuals, and this is kind of an interesting one because while the game has a ton of high fidelity opportunities with all the shrubbery, the vegetation, the trees, and the lighting, it's really hard to see enemies. And some of that is because there's this constant flickering that's happening around trees, buildings, and so on, like the shadows and all that. There's just so much going on visually that it can be a lot to take in. It often did take me a little bit more time to find some of the enemies that might have been looking for me through vegetation or looking across areas with a lot of vegetation, especially given some of the flickering and the contrast that was set up by the lighting. The flickering around the edges of shrubbery or in the shadows and stuff like that is kind of a mess, and I hope that is something they continue to polish with continued work. Like, as far as visuals, there were some improvements in visuals. Like, I noticed that the wind was not as strong in the vegetation, so it wasn't swirling as much as it was in the private playtest, as well as the fact that I didn't have as many textures popping in and out as I did in the private playtest a few weeks ago. There are certainly moments when you're running through Hell Let Loose Vietnam and it looks stunning, the sun cutting through the trees and all the vegetation, and then you'll just be running and things are kind of popping in and out of clarity, or shadows are showing up, or like on the side of a building, all the shadows look almost pixelated and flickery. It just makes it really hard to feel immersed in the environment that has so much opportunity to feel immersed. Now, in terms of performance, I think I saw a little bit of a mixed bag. There are times where it runs pretty smooth, but as the round progresses, it almost seemed like the server or the experience just started to degrade. There were issues that affected gameplay, even communication, because audio started to get a little bit wonky or delayed. As the round progressed, I noticed that soldiers that were further away, let's say 100, 200 meters, were starting to just skip across my screen. And these sort of things really negatively affect the player base when they're trying to jump in and just enjoy the first-person shooter aspect of it. They can't hit anybody because they're just skipping. Now, my frames generally were okay, but there were definitely times where it started to get bogged down. I heard the same from other folks where they would go through periods of time where it seemed fine or it seemed to be stable, and then it would start dipping. With high fidelity games these days, the devs are trying to make the game work across as many hardware combinations as possible, and I imagine this one just still needs a chunk of work because it's certainly not there yet from what I could see. Additionally, this game still has to make it on a console, and console didn't see it this past weekend. I'm really curious to see how all of that plays out. And I think the best thing the devs could have done is delay the release of the game. Frankly, I think the open beta was pretty early, and all of the announcement to the open beta to the release date happened pretty quick. So I'm happy to see that they're going to give it another 2 months. Now, I don't know how much can change in 2 months. Like, I had seen that in about 2 weeks, some improvements were made, but I'm curious to see what this 2 months will give the devs, because they have the opportunity to take a small step back and maybe work on things that they weren't going to have time for before the release, because now it's a necessity. Following playing in the open beta, I was a little hesitant about jumping into Hell Let Loose Vietnam upon release date because of what I witnessed in the open beta. There were just too many things taking me away from the gameplay that either were distracting or disruptive. But the delay, I think, is the right thing to do based on the feedback I heard from a lot of the people I played with and what I was starting to gather online. Looking back on the beta, and something I talked about during the live stream was there were moments where I had really fun times. Like, it was streaks of fun surrounded by a lot of, spawn, die, while being distracted by audio or the visuals or performance. I'm sure we're all going to be wondering what the devs are going to focus on. I would imagine we'll see a lot of focus on bugs or the reduction of bugs by the time we either get another playtest or the release of Hell Let Loose Vietnam. Performance is another big area tied to visuals, which sometimes those things work pretty hand in hand, but that would be another high priority area to help improve the experience. That is my coverage for the open beta. I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience, and then the delay news came out, so I figured we definitely had to cover some of this. it does seem like this is a good thing based on a lot of the feedback I've heard from players that had a chance to dive in this past weekend. So I look forward to hearing what you guys think down in the comments below. And of course, hit the subscribe button so you can be up to date on new videos covering this or other games. And with that, thank you guys for watching. Catch you next time.